Hello, I'm David Griffiths, Alliance for Unity's lead candidate in West Scotland and spokesperson for the Constitution. Now, following on from my last podcast, I wanted to say a little more about Alliance for Unity's plans ahead of next year's Holyrood elections. First, though, as is now customary, I wanted to run through some of the more bizarre behaviour of SNP senior figures in recent weeks. Firstly, there was the grotesque sight of Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP at Westminster, bullying an English photographer on Twitter. Blackford, some of you will remember, was previously involved in a quite disgraceful campaign to hound Liberal Democrat MP Charles Kennedy at a time when Mr. Kennedy was very ill. Now, this time round, Blackford took to Twitter to ask a photographer named Ollie Taylor why he had travelled from the south of England to Caithness in order to take photographs. Mr. Taylor replied by pointing out that he recently had moved to Scotland and he lives 5 minutes from the location where his photograph was taken. Blackford then tweeted a very grudging non-apology, and Nicola Sturgeon sprang forth to praise Blackford's grace and dignity in accepting that he'd in fact made a mistake. I was very happy to read that Mr. Taylor did not accept this apology from Mr. Blackford and is now suing him. And I wish Mr. Taylor every success with his legal action. In addition, lately we've seen projections from Scottish nationalist economists outlining their vision of an independent Scotland's currency. Yes, the currency question, the very question that had separatists stumped in 2014, is still causing them trouble today. So first up, we saw Andrew Wilson, author of the Growth Commission report, telling us that following independence, Scotland would continue to use the pound for an extended period. Up to 10 years, said Andrew. Although oddly, he didn't mention this would mean Scotland could not apply to join the EU for at least that period, as no prospective EU member can apply to join or become a member state while using the currency of a non-member state. Not allowed, I'm afraid. Unhappily for Andrew, though, there's a new pro-independence economist in town, Tim Rideout, who is apparently convener of the Scottish Currency Group. Now, I've never heard of them either. Tim is considerably more bullish than Andrew in relation to the timeframe for a new currency. Tim took to Twitter last week to state his belief that the new Scottish currency will be ready to commence trading within 1 or 2 months of Independence Day. So that's nice and clear. Independent Scotland will continue to use the pound for 2 months, or maybe 10 years. The SNP haven't quite made up their minds yet. Genius. Now, as this shows, 6 years after the Scottish independence referendum, where the electorate voted very firmly to say no, separatists still have no answers to the key economic questions. Now, the reason for this is there are no truthful answers which separatists can make, which will present the economic case for independence. It doesn't exist. All they can do is make up increasingly far-fetched and clearly fake projections, which frankly, a child could identify in a matter of minutes as a pack of lies. And that's what they're doing, clearly. Now, in my last podcast, I said that the UK Constitution is an area on which Alliance for Unity will focus extensively moving forward. Now, as we all know, the SNP will attempt to make next May's election with independence as the focal point. No question, that's what they're going to do. They're going to see it as a mandate for independence if they win, or a mandate for a referendum. Now, the reason for this is because the SNP have to talk about independence because, frankly, it's all they have left to talk about. They most certainly will not discuss their appalling record in office on Scotland's education, on Scotland's health, on crime, on housing, or, as I've mentioned, the economy. Now, ordinarily, a serving government, having been in power for 13 years, going into an election with such an appalling record, would face electoral oblivion. But, of course, these are extraordinary times. At the moment, we have the 3 main pro-UK, anti-independent Scottish parties, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and Labour. As things stand, each one is planning to field its own candidate in each constituency seat in the Holyrood elections. So each of the 3 parties is busy online telling voters that they are the right choice to defeat the SNP. Now, of course, the reality of this is it's complete nonsense. There is not the slightest chance of any of the three main parties defeating the SNP next May. It is quite literally impossible. Why? Because the modern day SNP is itself an alliance of many disparate groups standing under the banner of Scottish independence. Now, this pro-independence alliance is certain to receive enough votes from voters in order to win a majority in the event that the other three parties insist on fighting against each other. Three parties standing individually against an alliance which is running on a single message cannot win. It's the equivalent of rerunning the Brexit referendum with one Remain option on the ballot paper alongside three separate Leave options, all of which will take votes from each other. Now, that would never be allowed to happen because the result would be a foregone conclusion. But that's exactly what the Scottish electorate is being asked to vote on next May. And this is why Alliance for Unity is calling on the three main pro-UK parties to stand down their candidates in constituency seats which they cannot win, and instead to allow a single anti-independence candidate to run against the SNP. In addition to this, which seems incredibly simple and logical, in addition to this, Alliance for Unity will field candidates in the regional lists, and this will have the effect of increasing not only the number of anti-independence MSPs in Holyrood, but it will also greatly enhance the calibre of MSPs in Holyrood, which I'm sure you would agree is long overdue. So that is Alliance for Unity's plan in a nutshell in terms of the approach to the election. Now, in addition, as I also mentioned the last time I spoke to you, we are calling for the UK government to enact legislation covering any future attempts to break up the United Kingdom. This is quite simply not a matter that can be left to Holyrood for obvious reasons. It is not in the remit of a devolved regional administration to break up the United Kingdom. There must be binding Westminster legislation. Now, I've mentioned in the past the elapsed time between secession attempts. As we all know, senior SNP figures and Yes campaigners told us the 2014 referendum was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, once in a generation. The reality, of course, is that within days of the referendum taking place, Yes campaigners, independence campaigners were already demanding another vote. And this is the stalemate we face right now. We have the SNP Green administration in Holyrood demanding another vote, and the UK government saying no. Now, this has to end because, very simply, while the government in Holyrood are spending all their time crying about independence, they are most certainly not running Scotland. So a UK Government Clarity Act is needed to end this absurd never-ending. Now, in addition, it's essential that the Clarity Act agrees the framework of any subsequent independence votes. It has to agree first of who gets to vote. Now, as we know, Scottish independence would affect the whole of the UK massively. If you look at some figures, the population of Scotland comprises 8% of the UK population. Now, we know that considerably less than half of the Scottish electorate backs independence. So that means that a figure less than 4% of the entire UK population is currently trying hard to break up the country. Now, that can't happen. So firstly, Scottish voters who happen to work outside of Scotland, like in England, must get the vote. They must be eligible to vote. The age at which people get a vote must also be agreed. As you'll remember, last time, David Cameron, wanting to give the pro-independence campaign every conceivable advantage so they couldn't complain at the result, he allowed the minimum age of voting to be 16. Well, 18 is the minimum age to vote in a UK general election, and that should be the case in any subsequent vote affecting the entire country. So 18 should be the voting age. Also, the question to be asked in an independence referendum must be agreed. Now, really, the question being asked is, do you want Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom? And if you think it should, say yes. If you think it shouldn't, say no. That's the question people would be asked in an independence referendum, and the question should be framed as such. And these are just a few of the issues to be covered in the Clarity Act. There would be many more. The Alliance for Unity website and all of the Alliance for Unity candidates' Twitter accounts contain more details of the rest of the proposed makeup of the Clarity Act. And it's something we are very keen in seeing the UK government enact as soon as possible. So it's another brief update from me, because I know there are other candidates from whom you'll be hearing. Many thanks for listening. And one thing I would ask you to remember, now is also customary, as we go into another week of lockdown in which Scottish businesses are forced to remain closed, and people are instructed to observe increasingly absurd and often contradictory lockdown measures, just remember, It is now 10 months since the SNP government's finance secretary, Derek Mackay, was forced to resign after being caught grooming a schoolboy. I still can't believe I'm saying those words, really. It's also 10 weeks since SNP MP Margaret Ferrier took a train journey from London to Glasgow, knowing that she had tested positive for COVID-19. And ever since these two dates, both Mackay and Ferrier have been paid their full salaries, including expenses in the case of Mr. Mackay, although I'm not exactly sure what expenses he would incur in sending over 300 text messages to a schoolboy to tell him how cute he is. These people are elected representatives, and this is the example that they set. And that's just something I'd ask you to bear in mind if your income has been reduced, if your business is struggling, if you've lost your job, or if you're unable to visit loved ones. There is very clearly one rule for the public and a very different set of rules for SNP MPs and MSPs. And I would ask you, please remember this next May when it's time to cast your vote. Thank you for listening, and we'll speak again very soon.